Hi everyone, in this video we will be looking at Set 3 A Math Chapter 2 Equations and Inequality, tackling the theory of how do we solve quadratic inequalities. So let's begin. Before we start, we must first understand one very important basic fundamental concept first. What is the difference between a quadratic equation and a quadratic inequality? So let's recap. You should have learned a quadratic equation is something like this in this example over here. The highest power of x is 2, and I see an equal sign over here. So this makes this a quadratic equation. Okay, and you have learned in Sec 3 EMath, how do we solve quadratic equation? There are two ways which you can solve quadratic equation. You can either solve it by factorization, or you can also use the quadratic formula. So imagine over here, if I have this quadratic equation, you should know straight away, in order to solve this, I must first factorize it. So I use either your cross method or tic-tac-toe method to factorize this quadratic expression into this form over here. Then once you have factorized that, you can then solve the equation from here. Okay, this is solving by factorization. So take note that for quadratic equations, the solutions to x are values, either one or two solutions. Now let's look at quadratic inequality. What exactly is a quadratic inequality? It means that instead of the equal sign over here, you see in quadratic equations, now I will see an inequality sign. This makes this a quadratic inequality instead. So the big question, how do we solve quadratic inequalities? So let's dive in. Just to know that a comparison between quadratic equations and inequalities is that for quadratic inequalities, the solutions are a range of values instead of just certain values in quadratic equations. Okay, so let's begin. There are four main steps on how do you solve quadratic inequalities. Check the right hand side is equal to 0. Factorize your quadratic expression, sketch graph, and identify region. How to remember the steps? I've come up with a very simple acronym you can remember. Cats fight snakes intensively. C stands for check, factorize, sketch, and identify region. Okay, so you can see this image over here to help you remember. Cats fight snake intensively. I hope this helps you to remember the steps you need to solve any kind of quadratic inequality. Okay, so let's look at example. Recalling the steps over here. Let's look at example 1. Imagine if I have this quadratic inequality over here. Step 1, I check that right hand side is equal to 0. So step 1 done, check. Okay, so I can put a tick beside over here, check. Step 1 done. So once I've done that, I move on to step 2, factorize. So next step, I factorize my quadratic expression into this form over here, x plus 1 times x plus 5. That is done with step 2. Once I've done that, third step, I must sketch the graph. So now I'm going to sketch the graph. Imagine you draw your axis here first, and I check this based on this quadratic expression. I know that my coefficient of x squared here is a 1, and this is positive, so this means that this is a smiley face graph. So if I were to sketch, this will be a smiley face graph. And now I label my roots, meaning the intersection points between this graph and your x-axis. I know that based on this value over here, my roots are -1 and -5. This intersection here is negative, so therefore this will be -5, and this will be -1. Okay, so sketching part and label roots done. Step number 3 done. Last step, identify region. What does identifying region mean? This quadratic inequality means that I want to find the solution of x such that this graph here is below your x-axis. Less than means below. So therefore, if I were to look at this graph over here, maybe I can draw lines to help me visualize better. So if I were to break this apart, okay, I break this based on the -1 and -5. This is my graph. The part of the graph that is below your x-axis, if I were to highlight in different color, it is this part of the graph over here. So if I were to shade with a different color, this part is the region that is below your x-axis. So therefore, my final answer will take into account this range of values of x for this curve. Therefore, final answer is x is between -5 and -1. take note that this equation here is strictly less than, so I do not consider the points whereby the graph intersects your x-axis. Okay. Let's look at the next part now. Example 2. The last example to illustrate these steps. Now imagine, let's look at example 2. I have this quadratic inequality over here. I go back to the 4 steps again. Remember your steps again. If you forget, I'll write it at the side. Cats fight snakes intensively. I'll write it over here. Cats fight snakes intensively. So first one, step 1. C stands for check. Check that the right hand side is equal to 0. So over here currently it is not. So therefore I must subtract x squared from both sides of this inequality. I will get negative x squared plus x plus 2 greater than or equals to 0. So that's step 1 done. Okay. Now step number 2. Given this quadratic expression over here, step 2, F. Cats fight snake intensively. F stands for factorize. So I need to factorize this quadratic expression, and by factorization I'll get this form over here. That is step 2 being done. Step 3 now. Step 3 stands for sketch. Sketch what? Sketch the graph based on this quadratic expression over here. Take note, when I sketch this graph now, I note that the coefficient of x squared is a -1. -1 means that it will now be a set face graph. Okay. And therefore now I will label my 2 intercepts. In case you have forgotten how to get the intercepts or the roots over here, you just need to let each expression here be equal to 0 and solve for the value of x. So over here I will get -1 and 2, so I can label them over here, -1 and 2. Okay, and now I want the part of the graph that is greater than or equals to the x above the x-axis. So let's break apart this graph over here. Okay, if I were to draw dotted lines to visualize clearly, -1 and 2, the part of the graph that is above the x-axis is this part over here. Okay, and now this inequality includes greater than or equals to, which means that I also include this point over here, the intersection between the graph and the x-axis. So therefore, if I were to shade with a different color, this is the part of the graph that I want. Okay, so therefore, final answer to this question is simply, therefore, last part, identify, sketch done. Last part is identify, which is identifying based on looking at the region over here. I identify the answer, which is the graph, part of the graph that is above or equal to the x-axis, which means that the final answer is this range of values of x over here. So therefore your answer should be x is between -1, greater than or equals to -1, but less than or equals to 2. Okay, and that is the answer to example 2. So I hope that these examples help you better understand how do we solve quadratic inequalities using these 4 main steps over here. And that will be the end of this video.